She walked away with, "You betrayed me." She walked away with the words, "You betrayed me." 3 years later, the millionaire froze. She was back, and she wasn't alone. Arthur Bennett had always been the type of man who believed control was the key to success. At 30, as the CEO of Bennett Enterprises, he was the picture of corporate triumph. Tall, blonde, impeccably dressed, with penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see several moves ahead of everyone else. In the boardroom, his voice carried weight. His decisions shaped markets. In his personal life, however, those same instincts often became weapons. Eleanor Vance had entered his world quietly, not with an impressive resume or corporate connections, but with a grounded warmth that disarmed him. She had rich brown hair that caught the light like polished wood, deep brown eyes that didn't flinch under his gaze, and a way of asking questions that made him consider answers he had never rehearsed. They met at a conference where she was consulting on community engagement for one of Bennett's outreach projects. Over the next few months, their conversations stretched beyond work. Late-night phone calls, long walks, shared meals where business talk was quickly abandoned for stories about childhood and half-forgotten dreams. Arthur had felt something with her that he rarely allowed himself, vulnerability. But when his company began preparing for an aggressive expansion and IPO, he was told to eliminate that vulnerability. Advisors and board members, men and women who measured life in quarterly returns, began to warn him that any complication in his personal life could distract from the image they needed to sell. Eleanor, they implied, wasn't a scandal, but a risk factor. Someone whose values didn't align with the high-stakes corporate theater that was about to unfold. The whispers became strategy, and Arthur, so accustomed to thinking in terms of calculated moves, convinced himself that ending the relationship was the smartest decision. It happened on a rainy afternoon in his penthouse, with the glittering skyline behind them. He stood by the window, his hands in his pockets, speaking with the same quiet tone he used when delivering bad news to a client. He told her the timing wasn't right, that she deserved someone who could give her more than the scraps of attention he could offer. And finally, almost as if to close the deal, he added, "This is for the best." Eleanor didn't cry or plead. She simply stared at him for a long moment, as if she were memorizing the exact man in front of her. Then she said in a low voice, "You betrayed me." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of her perfume and an empty silence that the city lights couldn't fill. In the days that followed, Arthur plunged into work, telling himself he had avoided unnecessary drama and made the right choice. What he didn't realize was that her absence would linger in a way he couldn't shake. He had no idea where she had gone, and no one around him seemed to know either. She had disappeared completely, taking with her not just the comfort of her presence, but a part of him that he didn't yet realize he had lost. The new life. In the 3 years that followed Eleanor's departure, Arthur's professional life became a relentless cycle of victories that felt strangely hollow. Bennett Enterprises expanded into new markets, signed high-profile contracts, and rode the momentum of a record-breaking IPO. He was praised in business magazines, invited to speak at conferences, and held up as the picture of a self-made leader with an unwavering focus. Yet every night, when the day's noise faded and the city lights flickered outside his penthouse windows, he was left with the same heavy silence that had settled the night she left. He told himself he had traded distraction for discipline, that success required sacrifices, and that missing her was simply a symptom of having allowed someone to get too close. But the truth was harsher. There was an emptiness in his life that no amount of business milestones could fill. Meanwhile, Eleanor had built a different world, far from the glass and steel towers that Arthur inhabited. She had moved to a modest coastal town in Washington, where the air smelled of salt and pine, and where people cared less about her resume than whether she would join the community bake sale. She took a job as a local elementary school teacher, finding solace in the routine and the unpretentious kindness of her neighbors. But the most important part of her life arrived quietly, only a few months after she left Arthur: the birth of twins. Leo and Louis were identical images of one another, with soft blonde hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold more depth than their young years could explain. From the beginning, Eleanor knew she would raise them alone. She told herself it was to protect them from the instability of Arthur's world and the possibility that he would see them as an inconvenience or a liability rather than his sons. Life with the boys was both exhausting and profoundly rewarding. Eleanor learned to function on fragmented sleep, to juggle teaching with late-night feedings, and to stretch her modest income to cover everything from doctor visits to the ever-growing piles of laundry. She didn't talk about their father, but sometimes, when she caught the twins looking at her with those unmistakable blue eyes, she felt a pang of conflict. There were moments she would imagine what Arthur might say or do if he knew, but then she would remind herself just as quickly of the man who had chosen ambition over her, the one who had looked her in the eye and decided she wasn't worth the risk. However, the past has a way of pressing against the present when you least expect it. The boys were approaching their third birthday when a worrying diagnosis began to cloud the small, stable life Eleanor had created. It began with routine checkups, small irregularities in their heartbeats that the pediatrician thought were worth investigating. What followed were specialist visits, scans, and long conversations filled with terms she struggled to assimilate. By the time the cardiologist confirmed they would both need surgical intervention, the weight of the situation settled fully onto her shoulders. She was determined to handle it alone, as she always had. But in the quiet hours of the night, watching her son sleep, the thought she had avoided for 3 years began to resurface. If ever there was a time Arthur Bennett needed to know the truth, it might be now. She just didn't know yet how, or if, she could bring herself to make that call. The reckoning the day Eleanor's and Arthur's worlds collided again began like any other, with her balancing the chaos of getting Leo and Louis ready for a morning appointment. The boys were restless, chattering to each other in a private language only twins seemed to understand, their small hands clutching toy cars as she tried to coax them into their jackets. The cardiology follow-up had been scheduled for weeks, and she had braced herself for what the doctors might say, but she hadn't planned for the destination fate had arranged. The hospital they were visiting was in the city, hours from their quiet coastal town, and the return trip required them to pass through the regional airport. It was there, in the bright expanse of the arrivals terminal, that the moment happened. Arthur was stepping off a flight from Chicago, his mind still tangled in the threads of a high-stakes negotiation, when his gaze swept across the terminal and stopped on a figure he thought his memory had finally softened. Eleanor was standing near the gate, her brown hair falling over her shoulder, her hands steady on the small shoulders of 2 identical blonde boys. For a moment, his mind refused to connect the pieces. The boy's blue eyes, his eyes, watched the crowd with curious caution, and the air around him seemed to change. The noise of rolling luggage, boarding calls, and hurried footsteps all muted beneath the pounding of his heart. Eleanor saw him at almost the same moment. Her posture shifted instantly, straightening. Her expression became wary, as if she were bracing for impact. Arthur, still a few steps away, searched her face for something familiar, something beyond the walls she had built. He noticed how her features had matured in the years they had been apart, the faint shadows of exhaustion under her eyes, and the subtle strength in the way she held herself. The boys, sensing her sudden stillness, turned to look at him directly. That single moment of eye contact was like being dragged into a mirror that reflected not only the present, but all the choices that had led there. They didn't speak in the terminal. She guided the boys to a coffee shop just past security, clearly intending to have some privacy. He followed her, not close enough to seem intrusive, but not losing sight of them. When they finally sat down at a small table in the corner, she gestured for him to join them. Her tone was quiet, but with a silent warning. The boys remained close, leaning into her sides, their small faces a mixture of curiosity and caution. Arthur sat across from them, not knowing whether to start with an apology, a question, or the truth that had just slammed into him. Eleanor saved him the choice. She told him their names, Leo and Louis, and without softening the blow, the reality of their health. They had been diagnosed with congenital heart defects, and while both were managing for now, the doctors agreed that surgery was inevitable. He listened, his usual instinct to control a situation overruled by the simple fact that there was nothing to control. Only the weight of what had been kept from him and the understanding of why she had done it. She spoke without anger, but also without apology, explaining that she hadn't wanted their lives tangled in the machinery of his ambition, that she had been determined to protect them from being an afterthought in a world that valued profit over people. Yet here they were, in a moment neither of them had planned, with two small boys sitting between them, whose future might depend on the decisions made in the coming weeks. When she finished, the silence at the table was almost tangible. The boys drank juice from paper cups, oblivious to the storm raging above their heads. Arthur looked at them, then at her, and felt the ground shift under him in a way no corporate loss or victory ever had. This wasn't a boardroom problem to solve. It was a life already in motion, one he had been absent from, and one he suddenly knew he could no longer stay away from. The beginning of healing. Eleanor hadn't intended to tell Arthur as much as she did that day in the cafe. But once the truth about Leo's and Louis's condition was out, it seemed impossible to stop there. She described the appointments, the tense hours in waiting rooms with the boys distracted by coloring books, while she tried to memorize every word from the cardiologists. She told him about the surgical timelines the doctors were already drafting, and how the procedures, especially for boys so young, would require a team of specialists, an extended recovery time, and meticulous follow-up. The costs were staggering, not just in money, but in her ability to both keep her job and care for both boys at once. She had done her best to prepare for the road ahead, but the reality was daunting. Arthur listened with an uncharacteristic stillness. He wasn't taking mental notes on strategy or looking for the angle that would benefit him. He was absorbing every word as if it were the only thing that mattered. He could see the toll these years had taken on her, the way her voice carried a certain weariness that was deeper than a lack of sleep, the caution in her eyes that seemed to brace for disappointment before it could even land. Yet when she spoke about the boys, something in her expression softened. There was a fierce love there, an unwavering determination that reminded him why he had been so drawn to her in the first place. He asked her why she had never told him about them before. Eleanor didn't hesitate in her answer. She hadn't trusted that he would choose them over the demands of his career, and she didn't want them to be an afterthought in a life built around image and profit. "I walked away to protect them," she said, "and maybe to protect myself too. But that doesn't mean I ever stopped thinking about what it would mean for them not to know you." Her honesty was like a silent blade. It didn't wound with volume, but with precision. For a moment, he considered defending himself, pointing out the pressures he had been under, the constant advice from his board, the timing of the IPO. But the words felt empty before they left his mouth. The truth was simpler. He had made a decision back then, and it was one he couldn't undo. Now he was faced with another choice, one that mattered so much more. He leaned forward, his voice low but firm, and told her he wanted to help, not out of obligation or guilt, but because they were his sons too. He promised to cover the medical costs, arrange for consultations with the best pediatric surgeons, and be present for whatever came next. Eleanor studied him in silence for a long moment, as if she were weighing the sincerity in his eyes against the history between them. Finally, she nodded, though her expression held no hint of surrender, only cautious acceptance. "If you're in this," she said, "you're in it for the long haul. Don't disappear when it gets hard. Don't let someone else make decisions for you. They don't need a visitor, Arthur. They need a father." The weight of that word settled on him like armor and responsibility all at once. By the time they left the cafe, the air between them had changed. The years of separation hadn't erased the past, but something unspoken had taken root, a recognition that whatever battles lay ahead, they would have to fight them side by side. As they walked back to the bustling terminal, the boys each holding one of their hands, Arthur found himself walking in step with them, silently matching their rhythm for the first time. A quiet partnership. The weeks leading up to the surgeries blurred into a rhythm of hospital visits, consultations, and constant phone calls that seemed to stretch into the late hours of every night. Eleanor balanced her teaching duties as best she could, but her mind was consumed by the upcoming procedures for Leo and Louis. Each new test result was another piece of the puzzle the cardiologists needed to decide on the safest approach, and each appointment carried its own mixture of hope and dread. Arthur, true to his word, became fully involved. He rearranged his travel schedule, canceled speaking engagements, and arranged for meetings with specialists he trusted from around the country. It was the first time in years he had given himself over completely to something without weighing its potential return, and the shift was disorienting, but also reassuring to him. In the hospital hallways, his presence was impossible to miss. He was no longer the polished figure from magazine covers. He often wore worn jeans and a simple shirt, leaning over clipboards with surgeons, asking about recovery protocols, or simply sitting beside the boys as they played with building blocks on the waiting room floor. Eleanor watched him closely in those moments, noticing the small but unmistakable changes in his behavior. How he would kneel to meet the boys at eye level, how he would listen to their rambling stories without checking his phone, how his expression would soften whenever they instinctively reached for his hand. Despite their cooperative front, a tension lingered between him and Eleanor, not from hostility, but from the unspoken weight of their shared history. There were nights they would both stay in the hospital family lounge, long after the boys had fallen asleep, drinking lukewarm coffee and talking in measured tones. She asked him more than once if he was sure he could handle this, not just the financial cost, but the emotional one. He always responded the same way, not with promises of perfection, but with a steady reassurance that he wasn't going anywhere. The morning the surgeries were scheduled, the air in the pediatric wing felt different, heavier. The boys were prepped in adjacent rooms, each with a small stuffed animal clutched in their arms. Eleanor stayed with Louis, while Arthur accompanied Leo, each of them dividing their focus, but united in purpose. They exchanged brief nods in the hallway, a silent acknowledgement that whatever happened in the operating rooms, they were in it together. When the double doors finally closed behind the gurneys, Eleanor sank into one of the stiff waiting room chairs, and Arthur sat down beside her without a word. They waited in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because the one thing they both wanted, to see their sons safe and sound, was beyond words. Hours passed with trickle-down updates from the surgical teams. Each time a nurse came out, they both rose in unison, bracing themselves. The waiting was its own kind of test, trying patience and faith in equal measure. For Arthur, accustomed to solving problems through decisive action, the helplessness was almost unbearable. For Eleanor, who had carried this responsibility alone for so long, sharing the burden, truly sharing it, felt both strange and unexpectedly relieving. In that waiting room, without the armor of their past grievances, they began to see each other not as the people they had been, but as the parents their children needed them to be. When the surgeons finally emerged from the operating rooms, their faces held the cautious relief of professionals who had navigated a delicate road and come out on the other side. They explained that both Leo and Louis had responded well to the procedures. The repairs had gone as planned, and while recovery would be slow and carefully monitored, the prognosis was hopeful. Eleanor felt her knees weaken with the news, a near vertiginous release of tension after so many weeks of fear. Arthur, standing beside her, slowly exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It wasn't the loud cheer of a man celebrating a victory. It was something quieter, heavier, the sound of someone accepting the magnitude of what he could have lost. The boys were moved to the pediatric recovery wing, each in their own bed, but close enough that Eleanor could sit between them and hold a hand on each side. Their faces were pale against the hospital sheets, their small chests rising and falling with the steady rhythm of the machines assisting their breathing. Arthur stayed, refusing to leave even when the nurses assured him there was nothing more he could do. He paced the room in slow, measured steps, stopping to adjust a blanket or brush a lock of hair from a forehead. His expression was fixed in a way that suggested he was memorizing every detail. Those first few hours of recovery were marked by quiet exchanges between him and Eleanor. She thanked him for being there, not out of politeness, but with the sincerity of someone who had prepared to carry the weight alone and was surprised to find it was shared. He admitted that seeing them like this was harder than anything he had faced in business, that no amount of skill or influence could control the uncertainty that came with being a father. They talked about practical matters, medication schedules, follow-up appointments, the possibility of a home nurse. But beneath those conversations was a growing undercurrent of something unspoken, a fragile understanding that they were rebuilding trust, not in a rush, but moment by moment. When the boys finally began to stir awake, groggy and disoriented, Eleanor leaned close to soothe them, her voice soft and steady. Arthur came into view slowly, not wanting to overwhelm them. Leo blinked at him first, then Louis, their small hands reaching out in unison. Without hesitation, he took both of them, one in each hand, feeling the warmth of their fingers curl around his. The moment was silent, but it carried a weight far greater than any declaration he could have made. It was the first time they had ever touched their father knowing who he was, and something about that recognition settled deep within him. That night, Eleanor curled up in a chair between their beds, refusing the cot the nurses had brought in. Arthur sat across from her, his posture still straight, but his gaze softer than she had ever seen it. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The steady hum of the monitors and the slow breathing of their sons filled the silence. For the first time since she had left him years ago, Eleanor not only felt supported, she felt companioned. And for the first time in his life, Arthur felt the full gravity of what it meant to be a father. Not as a title, but as a choice he would keep making every single day. A forever choice. The days following the surgery settled into a rhythm that was both exhausting and strangely reassuring, as if the hospital had become its own self-contained world. The bright daylight that filtered through the blinds, the hum of the medical machines, and the faint scent of antiseptic formed the backdrop for long hours of waiting, of small signs of progress. Leo and Louis, though sore and easily tired, showed gradual improvement with each passing day. The first time Leo managed a weak smile for the nurse who brought him juice, Eleanor nearly cried. And when Louis mustered enough energy to ask Arthur to read him a picture book, it felt like a quiet victory that neither parent took for granted. Arthur had thrown himself into the role of being there, not in the occasional surface-level way she had once feared, but in the steady, firm presence of someone who understood that the smallest moments could be just as critical as the big ones. He learned to help adjust the boys' IV lines without tugging at the tubing. He memorized their medication schedules, and he even began tracking their progress in a small notebook. There was nothing glamorous about the work, but he embraced it as if it were the most important deal of his life. In the evenings, after the boys were asleep, he and Eleanor would often slip out into the hallway for a few minutes to let the nurses do their rounds. These conversations were different from their earlier exchanges, less about the past, more about the present, and sometimes they even dared to touch on the future. It was in one of those late-night conversations, leaning against the cold wall outside the recovery room, that Eleanor admitted she had spent years preparing for the possibility that he might one day re-enter their lives. She had imagined what she would say, how she would keep him at a safe emotional distance, but the reality had unfolded differently. Watching him care for his sons with a patience and dedication she had never before known in him had changed something inside her. Arthur listened without trying to defend himself, and instead told her that watching her raise them alone had been both humbling and painful. Painful because he hadn't been there, and humbling because she had managed to create such a stable world without him. The next week, as the boys grew stronger, Arthur began making discreet arrangements behind the scenes. He contacted one of the best pediatric cardiology rehabilitation programs in the country and secured spots for Leo and Louis. He hired a private nurse to assist them at home during the initial recovery phase, not to replace Eleanor's care, but to ensure she didn't carry the weight alone. When he told her about these plans, she stared at him for a long moment before simply saying, "I don't need you to fix everything. I just need you to stay." His response was simple, "I'm not going anywhere." The day came when the doctors announced the boys were well enough to be discharged. The moment was both joyful and terrifying, for leaving the safety of the hospital meant re-entering a world where every decision felt more high stakes. Eleanor packed their things while Arthur handled the discharge paperwork, and together they wheeled the boys out into the fresh afternoon air. For the first time in years, they left a place side by side. Not as strangers burdened by their history, but as two parents carrying the same hope forward. And as they drove toward Eleanor's house, with the boys asleep in the back seat, it felt less like a return to old wounds and more like the fragile, deliberate start of something new. At home, the atmosphere was a strange mix of relief and fragility. The boys were no longer surrounded by the constant beeping of monitors, yet the memory of those sounds still lingered in everyone's minds. The living room had been transformed into a recovery space, with soft blankets laid out, a small medical station set up in the corner, and the nurse Arthur had hired quietly taking notes on their vital signs. Eleanor moved through the house with practiced precision, handling medications, preparing light meals, and tracking the twins' activity levels. Arthur, no longer the occasional visitor in their lives, had begun spending most of his days there, his laptop pushed aside more often than not as he chose to sit with the boys as they napped or played. The twins took time to adjust to their father's constant presence. At first, they still looked to Eleanor for reassurance whenever Arthur suggested something, reading a story, building blocks, or helping them down the steps to the backyard. Gradually, however, their hesitation faded. Louis began to ask for him in the mornings, and Leo began to pull on his hand whenever he wanted to show off a new drawing. Arthur was careful to never push too hard, giving them space to warm up to him on their own time. Eleanor also noticed the subtle shifts. The way Arthur seemed to measure his words more carefully. The way he would study their moods, like a man trying to learn a language for the first time, determined not to make a mistake that would cost him their trust. The evenings became a quiet ritual. After the boys were in bed, Arthur and Eleanor would meet in the kitchen, talking over cups of tea. Sometimes the conversations were light, filled with small observations about the day, and sometimes they ventured into deeper territory. Eleanor began sharing pieces of the years he had missed. The first time the twins had laughed in unison, the night she had stayed up worrying through their first fevers, the morning she had dropped them both off at daycare half asleep. Arthur listened without interrupting, letting her paint a picture of a life he hadn't been there for, but desperately wanted to be a part of now. There were hard moments, too. The boys had nightmares more than once in those first weeks, waking up crying from dreams they couldn't fully explain. Eleanor would run to their room, but she began to notice Arthur arriving just as quickly, sometimes even before her. He didn't always know the right words, but he quickly learned that sometimes all they needed was for him to sit on the edge of the bed and hold their hands until they fell back asleep. Those nights left him completely awake, long after the house had gone silent, realizing that being a father wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the smallest, most consistent acts of showing up. As spring began to creep in, the boys grew stronger. The nurses' visits became less frequent, and their doctors cleared them for short walks outside. Arthur was there the first time they ventured to the park together, a small victory that felt bigger than any award or corporate milestone he had ever achieved. Watching the twins run toward the swings, their laughter carried on the breeze, he looked at Eleanor, and for the first time in years, there was no cautious distance in her expression, only the quiet acknowledgement of a shared triumph. One night after the boys had fallen asleep, Arthur walked out onto the porch, where Eleanor was sitting with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He sat down beside her, and for a while, they didn't talk. He finally told her that he wasn't just staying for the boys. He was staying because he wanted to be a part of her life again too, if she would let him. She didn't respond right away, but she didn't turn away either. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden embrace, just a slow, deliberate understanding passing between them in the quiet night air. In that moment, they both knew that what they were building was fragile, but it was real, and it was theirs. And for the first time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something they could face together. The final promise, in my opinion. This story is proof that life does offer second chances, but they never take you back to the exact spot where everything started. It's not a cliché, happily ever after. It's a journey through mistakes, loss, and the understanding that love and family aren't just feelings, but choices you must prove with your actions every single day. I like that the ending isn't loud or theatrical, but quiet, and that makes it all the more powerful. The characters aren't magically brought together by fate. They make a conscious decision to move toward each other, despite the fear and pain of the past. This isn't a story about perfect people, but about those who learn to become a better version of themselves for someone who matters more than their own ego. The most valuable part of this ending is that it leaves room for the future. We can see that their life ahead will still be challenging, but they now have a shared desire and will to face it together, and that's stronger than any words or promises. What did you think of the new names in the ending? Don't forget to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of redemption and love.